It's Saturday night. I think it's May 6th. That's correct. And we just had our full moon, and we posted out the other night. It's been a fairly full last few days. And I was just reminded that although it's not the same in the Thai calendar, that for many other Buddhist countries it was Visakha Puja on the 5th, May 5th. A recollection of the Buddha and his life, the gifts we've received from his teachings. I think for many of us here at the monastery, it's been quite a contemplative last few days. And as most of you know, we had a death in the community. And with someone here who's Daniel Fry, who's been coming here for so very long, over 15 years, 16 years. And sometimes we hear about somebody dying and it's just third hand, or it doesn't have much meaning. Well, when it's somebody you know and who is also dear to you, it takes on a whole different experience in the mind. And so we had what essentially was a funeral gathering, and monks did some quite beautiful chanting and listened to many other people who knew Daniel and how they remembered him quite fondly and dedicated song and poetry to him. And we also had a house blessing that we attended. And I was just reminded that Bhikkhu Bodhi will come up here for a day in a couple of weeks, just to stop in, have the meal. But that'll coincidentally be his 50th birthday as a bhikkhu, that very day. And so there are these, there are so many events in our lives, these points that we have of meaning that we take, the signs and reflections of how we live, and trying to bring in this practice that the Buddha has taught us and encouraged us towards what he says and what he has taught us is full liberation, the ending of all suffering, and the ending of what it's just not exactly that meaning, but it's the ending of the rebirth into cyclic suffering. And it's something that's quite hard to fathom, quite difficult to kind of put into words. In fact, he didn't try to spend his entire life describing exactly what that meant, because he did so in many ways, but he also explained that he couldn't make it a concept for people. He didn't want it to be something that those that he taught attached to. So the more of course, people that wanted it defined and wanted to know, exactly what he was talking about, what liberation is. He went so far, but he did try to preclude that potential for attachment to what he taught. And so I was thinking about these events and just the meanings that we take in our lives, and also pairing that with what Ajahn Cunda has been talking about, how we really think about our practice, how we think about ourselves, and whether our practice is good enough, or what's right, or the particular perception of whether we're really getting it right, doing it right, and whether it's really worth it at all. And I do just keep coming back to that question, for my own life and what I've experienced. There can definitely be distractions. There can definitely be times of busyness within the mind, or even sometimes pushing the Dhamma away. But it just comes back to that there is so little time that we might have, and I just can't see for myself, what else is worth it? What else is there to do? What else is there that really has that same potential for liberation? And if you find something else, okay, that's good for you. I'm happy for that. But for my own sense, the beauty of what the Buddha taught was that it's just that much. It's what he presented to us, and he said that's enough. Most of you know his famous sutta around just asking the monks about how many leaves in his hand he had, and whether there were more leaves in his hand or more leaves in the forest. And the monks, maybe a few of them, were thinking, is this a trick question? So obviously one of the monks said, well, of course, the few leaves in your hand are very few, and the leaves in the forest are many. And he just said, that's the exact same as the teachings that I'm giving you, because I could explore so many other things that I've experienced and understood and known, but none of them lead to liberation. It's just this small amount of information I'm giving you, which is a lot actually, that he passed on in his life. But it wasn't so complicated that the multitude couldn't understand his teachings when applied and when understood. And so he taught what he needed to teach. And in this very week, with having a blessing over someone's house, having a blessing over someone's death, questioning our own practice and whether it's worth it, or how we're doing, and often this kind of sense of my practice isn't good enough, or I should be practicing more, or I wish I didn't have all these distractions in my life, I'm too busy. And I know this quite well because this is what comes up in my mind. But when I think of a life well lived, when I think of Daniel Fry, and I think of the goodness that he brought to others, and the goodness that I saw that shown in his own life, I can say, yeah, he brought that in. He brought that Dhamma in, and was always curious about it, and continued in his own way towards his understanding of the Buddha's teachings. And so, for right now, Daniel is a wonderful teacher for all of us, dying at 40 years of age, and in quite a sort of a freak event of of just choking on some food is what it appears brought his end. And I looked that up today, and at least in 2021, there was about 5,000 people in the United States that died of choking. And it's across the board, it's all ages. From infants to those in their 10s, 20s, 30s, it just can happen to anyone. And for most of us, we might have experienced that sometime in our life. We choked, having not been able to bring in the breath that gives us life. And it, for a while, it perhaps affected us. Wow, that was a close call. But when it actually ends a life, it's one of those rare things that occurs, but it, just like with Daniel, somebody who we're associated with, it really can happen. Any of these kind of strange events can happen. And just coming back from his funeral, we were talking a little bit. He came out, and I heard this motorbike. And then the motorbike engine stopped, and then I heard a click-clack sound. That wasn't normal. So I went to follow up with Tante Jasaro, and sure enough, we could see that there was a motorcyclist. I couldn't quite see his motorcycle, but he was standing up and seemed to be a bit shocked. And also looked like he was trying to get his bike up, start his bike, wasn't working, walked around, and then I saw that what was on the ground and how this incident occurred, that the engine stopped, was that he had spilled, he had hit a deer and pretty much killed it. It was just barely alive. And from at least the bodily movements he was making, I think he had gone down pretty hard, and then was trying to just examine his own body. And so there it was, just in that moment, again, death. And he dragged the deer off to the side of the road. And I think he probably died quite quickly after that. And so this is something that it's so easy to take for granted. And just before the talk, I was just feeling my heart and the beating of the heart, and knowing that very feeling, that feeling in the body, experience of the heart, and how easy it could be just for that to stop. And the Buddha's teaching on reflection around death is, we often hear it that his suggestion is you should reflect on death this often. But the sutta that I remember, and I think it's in a couple of suttas, where he asks monks how often should monks have this reflection on death. It's actually, he adds another statement to it. It's not just a death reflection. He says, to reflect on death so that one might be able to recognize, may I have this much more time to practice the Dhamma. May I have this much more time left to understand the Dhamma. And how much time should we really encourage ourselves to think about what's important? And so the various monks offer up some suggestions. I think one is once a day, and there's twice a day. And of course, as the suttas go, the Buddha's listening, and other monks keep volunteering until one says, I'll try to get this right, he says that the time that it takes to chew and swallow a morsel of food. And then another says, the time that it takes to take an in-breath, and I'm sorry, I can't remember whether it's or an out-breath or and an out-breath. So roughly between 2 and 4 seconds. And the Buddha says that those 2 last monks are correct. That's about the amount of time one should really bring to mind, I may have this much time left to understand the Dhamma. And so his encouragement is to know that our life might end within that period of time. Basically a few seconds to maybe 15 seconds. And so with Daniel's death, I really have been trying to keep that alive within myself, just to know that that's what's so important. Because that fades, doesn't it? I mean, the sense we have when someone we know dies, it can fade, even if we're close to them. And as I was remarking at the funeral, there's a sense of also kind of not wanting to think about it. It's a denial we often have. Because of course there is fear around it, fear around our own mortality. Just not waking up one morning. And it's not for everyone, but it seems to be fairly common. This fear of the unknown, the fear of the change. And for most of us, that comes from a sense of self, a sense of our, not just self-preservation, but a belief in who and what I am. That I am this continuing being, that I continue to persist minute after minute, hour after hour, day after day. This is who I am, this is what I am, these are my thoughts. This is how I think about things. These are the people I like. These are the people I don't. These are my political beliefs, the job I do. These are my children, my parents. This is me. And then we repeat that over and over and over again to ourselves. And so we take that to be what I am and what my consciousness is and how I think and believe. And this is how the Buddha really talks about these 5 khandhas, how attached we are to all of the things that we contact through our own mind and body, and the pleasant and unpleasant feelings that we experience, and our particular perceptions and memories, and the thoughts that we cherish so much. And then the fact that we know those thoughts. And that's all me. And so the fear around death is often around losing that. That won't exist anymore. I won't be able to have that, cling to it, be that. And so I think for me the lesson that I continue to take from losing somebody close is just continuing to remember how easy that is, how that potential is so close, not just for anyone I know, but for myself, and how important that is to remember that in my sense of the time that's left, to really try to engage with the teachings and to not waste time, to not take this whole life for granted. And that's quite difficult because the tendencies for our own minds, the sort of unwholesome tendencies, is that distraction it's the best thing for us. sticking to a screen and enjoying the wonders of that screen as long as I don't have to think about this loss of self. Or we tune out of our relationships to others, those things that create vulnerability, fear, pain. There's a sense of wanting to get away from that. And so people will sometimes say, oh, to think about this, why would you ever want to have these morbid thoughts? And that's taking the sense of the morbid as the negative. Taking death as a negative teacher, something that is to be avoided. And it's a sad misunderstanding, because death is really our biggest advisor, our greatest teacher. And when we let it in, then there is so much we have to learn, so much that we can open up to the fears that we don't want to allow in and recognize. Just that contemplation of the body, the contemplation of what is it to have a beating heart? To recognize that, not in a sort of romantic sense, but like a bloody, a heart that's it's just pumping and working out, and it's got different muscles, and they're not just something that is sort of solid and something plasticky. It's wet and it's moving, and there's different layers to it. And the blood vessels. And each one of us has this thing, and it's an organ that it can just stop at any moment for any one of us. And we have a lot of these organs. And so if there's any discomfort with that, that's perfectly normal, but also incredibly beneficial to say, okay, what is this about? A discomfort of the flesh. Thinking about, if you are on an examination table and opening up your own body and just seeing the different parts and the liquids and the movement. We often enjoy dressing ourselves up and making sure that our hair looks good and our skin doesn't have any marks on it. We might be averse to wrinkles, aging, signs of sickness. But this is our body. This is what it's made of. And so it's a very poignant part of practice, just really trying to bring our minds to having a sense of the fragility of this body, and knowing, sometimes I'm just wondering, how is it even possible that I can even walk a step, I can move, and even speak, or I just in the next moment just don't have an aneurysm and just fall over. And so there's often for myself, I can see a distancing from that. And then if I can muster the strength and bring myself to that, examining that sense that I have of wanting to push it away, then I see that it's very ripe for contact and for reflection. That sense of our own mortality. I don't know how many of you have experienced that, where you really think about your own death. You think about what it would be like to die. It's that activity of dying. The body's functioning's ending. And for me, what comes to mind is that immediate sense of self, that sense of what about me, I, where's it going? And there's a sense of for myself, not wanting to lose that. And a fear of what existence would be without that notion of thought and being me. And so some of the things that have come up, some of the themes that have come up around this week is just, questioning practice and whether it's really worth it, whether it helps, whether my practice is good enough or what it's doing for me, when will I get the insights. Is it really worth it? And it just comes back to, are you ready for death? Are you ready to die right now? And when I ask that question to myself, the answer is no. And so then I have to ask, so if I'm not ready, I'm not saying, of course, that I'm not asking the question, do I want to die? But if I'm not ready to die, then what is it that I'm not ready for? How have I not prepared myself? In the Buddha's reflection around how often we should remind ourselves of the time we have left to practice the Dhamma. That's what he says. He says the time that it takes you to swallow a morsel of food, or breathe an in-breath or out-breath. And for Daniel, that was it. That's what he had. Exactly that space in between those two actions. And so for each of us, then we can really try to take that in and understand that and see, yes, this might be the amount of time we have left. And to try to keep that alive within us, to fan really the flame of getting that, to not let the embers grow cool and darken, but to keep them bright and to keep our interest in what we're trying to explore to the forefront of our own practice. And so then we bring that in, and as Ajahn Cunda was mentioning before, that sense of trying to also move our minds away from my practice and this is about me, and I have to figure it all out based on whether I'm getting something or not. Or we just move into that sense of how can I keep practicing? How can I keep this alive within myself so that day after day, hour after hour, minute after minute, moment after moment, we just keep applying ourselves to that understanding. We keep that sense of attempting to really understand what mindfulness is. what that sense of peace is. What is it to move towards the wholesome and to relinquish the unwholesome? And then we forget it and we let that forgetting go. We do not need to attack ourselves and question whether it's really worth it or not. We just drop it and continue on. Because if you have some glimpse or understanding or some sense of the Buddha's teachings, I just don't see what else there is to do. And so we're just continually trying to remind ourselves of that. We have this much time left. We have this much time left to practice and this much time left to allow ourselves to not be distracted and move towards that which is difficult and often hard to understand, and yet we apply ourselves nonetheless. Because the Buddha didn't mince words. He said this is the most difficult thing a human being can do, to end suffering. And so if we're willing to try to keep that up in our own minds, to keep that on the forefront, then that question of whether it's worth it, it just evaporates, it disappears. Because in that very notion of our practicing, we let go of me and my, and what I need, and how it should be, and I better get. I was asking one of the younger community members about his practice, and he said, I practice anapanasati, practice Bhutto. That was the end. That was the end of the sentence. It's not that complicated. Extremely difficult, but observing the mind and trying to understand the defilements, trying to just basically see what gets us into trouble, and how we can, just through observation and understanding, see the direction we need to move. And so the complications of me and mine, they no longer present those problems. Problems of obsessing around what the right thing is to do, or the doubting, should I do this, should I do that, where should I go, who should I talk to? So this is how we can advise ourselves, and this is how we can, as I've been mentioning through this talk, use death as our advisor, and really have a sense of knowing our own mortality, the fragility with which we have with this body that we live within. And then using that to propel ourselves towards the end of all dukkha, the end of all suffering, and the end of rebirth. So that true contentment, happiness, and peace can arise. Anyone?